This is the story of a professional swindler. A Toronto man who duped hundreds of victims in several countries into giving him money and then even more money in dubious stock schemes or fake colored diamonds. I'm Dave Breckenridge and this is 10-3. National Post investigative reporter Adrian Humphreys joins me to discuss how this Toronto businessman wound up embroiled in massive money scams, how he wound up on police radar, and how he kept his schemes rolling for so long. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Adrian, today we're going to be talking about a pretty interesting character in Canada's criminal world. And to give listeners just, a starter, a bit of a description about the individual we'll be talking about today. Who is Jack Cronis?
Sure, because he is quite interesting and he's also almost entirely unknown. Jack Cronis is a Toronto man who's a polished swindler. I mean, simply to say it. I mean, he is a professional con man with a silver tongue. He can talk money and more money and then tons of money from victims over the phone because he's learned his trade from some of the notorious fraudsters from the golden era of boiler rooms. There was a time when Canadian conmen were renowned the world over for their clever talking, and he learned from them. And he's now 65 years old, and he spent nearly all of his adult life scheming and scamming and swindling people.
I do want to talk about Jack's background a little bit, but I guess that kind of triggered another question for me here. You talk about Canada having these world-renowned scammers in these boiler rooms and this golden age of fraudsters. How did Canada get this reputation for having these kind of world-renowned crooks and criminals?
I'm not sure exactly how it developed. I suspect there was like one or two really good ones that went abroad and were successful, and they called all their friends in. It might also have to do with the accent, the Canadian accent. It doesn't sound American. It doesn't sound too British, but it sounds somewhere in between. And some people, it's certainly not a, in the English world, it's a fairly understandable accent, but the bottom line is there was just an outrageous scamper of these guys. I mean, dozens of people who had traveled the world working in these boiler rooms. Many of them settled in Amsterdam for a number of years because Holland didn't have its sort of a stock commission. So they sort of could get away with things they couldn't get away with in other countries. But they were making long distance phone calls. And then when one boiler room was busted, they moved to another country, and sometimes in Asia and sometimes down to the Caribbean or like all over the world. And they were. It was an embarrassment to Canada because they were fleecing people globally out of millions and millions of dollars. It was an era where the hijinks of sort of Hollywood movie proportions were they were living the high life of spending money almost as fast as they could swindle it.
Yeah. Now back to Jack Cronis. You say he's a Toronto man. What was his life like in Toronto growing up? What background did he come from? Was it lower class? Was it working class? Did he grow up in a life of crime?
Jack grew up with his parents and an older brother in a very nice bungalow in the North York area of Toronto, near Bathurst and Highway 401, for those who know the city. And he did have family money. His mother was the daughter of a very successful bed frame and mattress maker in Toronto, and her and her brothers inherited this, and it eventually Jack's father became a vice president of that company, and it made them quite rich. It was a very large company that became sort of the selling point for these big weekend furniture ads in all the newspapers. And he loved that company because it made him rich, and they had a very solid, well-to-do upbringing with the fine clothes. He could drive as soon as he got his driver's license, he started driving his dad's convertible Cadillac to school and driving the girls to McDonald's and stuff like this in this Cadillac. And he really enjoyed the physical aspects that the money in the company brought him.
So we have a guy with pretty, well-to-do upbringing, seemed to have not everything handed to him, but fairly comfortable life. How does he go from a seemingly upscale upbringing to a decades long life of crime and fraud?
The impetus seems to be the downfall of that very bed company. So the very first time that I'm aware of that Jack got caught doing something wrong in the investment swindle business, his lawyer told court that Jack was motivated by a need for easy money because he was desperately seeking to reclaim the lifestyle that he had growing up because uh, after the family business collapsed. So basically, the second generation of the family expanded too quickly, and they ended up going bankrupt. That visibly interrupted his luxurious life. And his lawyer said that he was obsessed with that lifestyle and reclaiming that lifestyle, and that he was obsessed with the markers of luxury. And I believe that to be true. I believe that to be precisely why Jack didn't have a ton of skill sets other than he was a fantastic talker, a good salesman, and he had a conscience that seemed to allow himself to be a financial predator on others.
Yeah. Now, looking at some of the crimes that he was involved in, what kind of scams were involved here? You talk about boiler rooms earlier, and for people like me, like start thinking about movies like Boiler Room for one, but like notoriously the Wolf of Wall Street, and how the Jordan Belfort character got involved with these kind of penny stocks and convincing people to spend lots of money on these things that weren't necessarily a financial sure thing, but they were sold that way. Was that the kind of scam that Cronis was involved in? Was it stocks? Was it other valuables? How did that work?
A police officer in Toronto who had investigated Jack for some years told me that it was exactly like the Wolf of Wall Street setup. He was always involved, as far as I've been able to trace, in investment type scams. So these are the telemarketing, and they would contact people who they could trick into, convince, prod, perhaps lie to invest in them. And they were poor investments; they were fraudulent investments, and he would fleece them of their money. This is the setup that Jack Cronis repeatedly engaged in, but sometimes with different commodities. And I understand that he was told police that the commodity didn't really matter, that you could give him almost anything, and he could turn it into a pitch for an investment, a good investment. And he said that if you're good enough at it, you know, people will just give you money for almost anything. So using this template of this investment scam telemarketing template, he has been caught fraudulently selling stocks and bonds, or stocks, securities. He has been caught and convicted of selling rare metals, pretending that they're precious metals, and he has also been caught selling, most recently, diamonds, particularly colored diamonds, as an investment vehicle, and those investments didn't work out for hundreds of people.
We'll be right back. And when we talk about these scams, they convince buyers to invest money in it, and then what happens? What happens then? So they get the money, and then do they string along the investors that say, "Hey, your stock is doing really well. Maybe you should sell it and buy in another stock that they happen to have an interest in," or do they try and convince them, keep them from selling the stock so they can hang on to that money? Like how do these scams like this work?
They operate on almost like a template. They have this system, and they just pipe in the product. So what they do is they have these boiler rooms, as we talked about, which are like telemarketing centers, call centers, and they're staffed with a hierarchy. So they often have, like in this particular case, most recently they had largely international students working the phones, making cold calls on lists that they buy. Um, and trying to suss out if the person on the other end might be willing to talk a little bit about a possible investment. Once they get a sucker on the line or someone who shows any interest, they immediately transfer the call. That first band is called qualifiers, and they would transfer the call to what they call an opener, and these are junior salesmen, and they try and convince the guy to, and it's usually a guy, it's usually a male, they go after into making a fairly small investment, a couple $100, $300, something that's not going to be too risky, that the person might be comfortable with doing, and they enact that transaction. And if they get that, they then pass that file on to what's called a loader, which is a senior salesman. They call it a loader because they over time load up the sucker, as they call them, the victim, as most people would see them, the victim with more and more and more investments, and they load them up as much as they can possibly can. But the key is, and this is what differentiates sort of the old school golden age of boiler rooms, it's done slowly over time. It's not like these online fraudsters that drain your bank account right away. So what the loader does is they wait a few weeks, sometimes a month, a period of time, and then they contact the person and they say, well, Dave, that diamond you bought for $300 is now worth, $795. Imagine how much you would have made if you'd bought more. And they inevitably end up buying more and more. And then they pull this stunt over and over again. Those are this. And then they start bringing in variations. So if it's a stock they're selling, they'll have a second stock that they're manipulating, and they'll say, "I'd like you should sell this stock to buy this stock." When they were doing rare metals, it was, you should sell this metal for this metal. And in the diamond world, what they were most recently caught doing was they were selling, say, yellow diamonds to the first investor or pink diamonds to the first investor. And then they say, well, the market's really shifting to yellow diamonds. They're much more valuable. You should buy yellow diamonds or trade your pink diamonds for yellow diamonds, but there's a surplus. And they do this a couple of times. And then when a victim starts to say, well, I'm making money, I'd like to cash out and get some of it, that's the last thing they want, because the diamonds either don't exist or they've overvalued them in the first place. So they convince them then, well, the best thing for you to do is make it up for auction. But in order to do that, you have to have larger diamonds, and they need to be green, or they need to be set in jewelry. And we can do that for you, and it's going to cost you this much. And so they convince them now that in order to profit from all their investment, they have to actually spend more money to either have bigger diamonds, the right color diamonds, or prettier diamonds. Those auctions, again, they don't really exist. It's just a tactic to get more money, and also a tactic to delay them from complaining, either suing them or calling the police, or making a stink and demanding they get money back. But in the end, they call it in the Wolf of Wall Street, and the police use this expression as well, like a Ferris wheel. They keep them on the Ferris wheel. I compare it more to like a grinder. They just keep them in the grinder. They just never allow them to cash out. The money stays within the swindle because it's probably already been spent and divided amongst the swindlers. And then they do that until the thing collapses. And by then, they've already moved on to another scam.
Was Jack Cronis mostly dealing with Canadian scams, or was he kind of based in Canada but scamming people from all over?
He started in Canada, as most people do. You get your job close by. But he was ambitious, it seems, and he went, like many, he went to Holland at first to operate in a very large, quite sophisticated stock swindle there. And that fell apart when someone got caught trying to get money out of a Belgian bank. In Europe, it became a very large swindle and quite the scandal, with hundreds of thousands of victims have lost many millions. When he got caught there, he would move back to Canada for a bit, did a swindle here, but that involved selling to Americans. And they also did some cross-border work in terms of warehousing and mailing, because they wanted to look like a Wall Street company or a big American company. And the diamond swindle also, they targeted very much the American investor. They had a lot of money there. There's a larger victim pool because they have a larger population. And many of their victims, in fact, the majority of the victims, it turns out, ended up being Americans. And that caused him a lot of problems in the end, because they also have to then face American justice, which, there's a lot of mistakes in popular representations of America. But one thing that they get bang on is that American justice is a lot stiffer than Canadian justice.
Very true. For someone who's been doing it for as long as it seems that Jack Cronis has been involved in these kind of scams, how many times has he been caught?
Well, I've traced him through getting caught in Toronto, getting prosecuted in Buffalo, getting prosecuted in Belgium, getting prosecuted in Cleveland. Those are the big cases that I know about. And I believe that's fairly comprehensive, but I don't know how many other scams that he didn't get caught for. And I don't know how many, if there are, in fact, any other activities that I'm unaware of. It's a pretty wide geography out there. And, when conmen assess, they do these peer, when they're talking together and they peer review other conmen, they always judge them on two things. This is what I was told by several conmen: their take and their give. And what that expression refers to is how much they've taken from victims and how much they've had to pay for it, how much their give is based on how many times they've been caught or punished. And, I think Jack's very heavy on both of those measures. He's taken a lot, and he's having to give a lot, and he's about to have to give a lot more.
When we talk about that he's taken a lot, do we have a sense of like how much he's swindled over the years? I assume it's in the millions, but is it like in the tens of millions or is it the hundreds of millions?
It's difficult to say because these scams aren't lone wolf operations. The difficulty with a large investment scam is you need multiple people. We already talked about you need the qualifiers and the openers and the loaders, and then they often have a guy called a cooler whose job is to cool down people that are getting upset. There's a lot of people involved. So the overall amounts are definitely in the hundreds of millions from my calculations. How much of that can be directly attributed to Jack's victims, I'm not entirely certain of. He has also had restitution orders over the years, and there's also some uncertainty about whether those have been fulfilled, and whether they're to what degree they've been fulfilled, how much he may have had to have given back. I don't get a great sense that the courts aggressively chase these restitution orders. He has claimed variously in court proceedings that he is bankrupt or he is broke. In one case, he claimed to have lost his money through gambling, but then authorities found money in a bank account in Turks and Caicos. That was his. They say so. It's really hard to quantify, but certainly the loss tallies from the scams he's been involved with are hundreds of millions.
And when you say you have to give a lot, and he's going to have to give a lot soon, without giving too much away, because I know that this story that you've put together that'll be launching soon on nationalpost.com is a fantastic read. I've had a look at it. What scam was it that he was most recently caught for?
One of the big investment scams that Toronto particularly has become known for is colored diamonds, investing in colored diamonds. And there has been at least a half dozen, probably more, companies that mix and match personnel and salesmen. There's usually a connection, either an ownership or the sales group, who have been pushing these colored diamonds on people, mainly in Canada and the United States. And it is something that Jack perfected. It's something that Jack became a leading salesman in, and it is that which has got him in his most recent trouble. Because Jack, as I've found over the several months that I've been following him and speaking to people and listening to victims and listening to investigators and contacting all sorts of people who knew him, is that he had a secret weapon that allowed him to avoid most of the egregious punishment that you might expect for a guy who's been caught so many times. And that was an unexpected and interesting part of my investigation on how he minimized his responsibility for all of the victims and what he did to them.
Mm-hmm. And for listeners who want to check that out, your feature, Jack of Diamonds, can be found at nationalpost.com. Adrian, always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much for your interest, David. I really appreciate it.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Adrian Humphreys. You can read this whole story at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.